Good morning and welcome. Welcome to this third installment of the 1619 Project. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. David Daniels with us this morning. He's joined the faculty of McCormick Theological Seminary in 1987 and was inaugurated Professor of Church History in 2003. He has an MDiv at Yale and a PhD at Union Theological Seminary in New York. He's an author of various articles and book reviews on the history of Christianity. He serves on the editorial committee of a New History of World Christianity project, and he serves as a member of various research projects, Religion in Urban America and the Funding of Black Churches project, and several other research projects. Dr. Daniels has lectured at various colleges and seminaries in many different countries in 3 continents, North America, Europe, and Africa, and teaches a wide variety of courses on church history and spirituality at McCormick Theological Seminary. And if you would just pray with me, we'll pray us into this session. Gracious God, we ask for wisdom and discernment. We would ask that you would put on our hearts what we need to learn from this seminar and other seminars like this. Help us to discern what we might do to pursue racial justice in our world, what actions we might take, what conversations we might have. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. And without further ado, Dr. Daniels.
Good morning. Thank you all on this snowy Chicago day. Matter of fact, I was waiting to get an email saying that everything was going to be on Zoom. So it's delightful to be here, and I would like to say that I've had a chance to interact with Fourth Church since 1987, and various pastors. The one that I interacted the most was Pastor John Buchanan, and so it's a delight to be here. I couldn't decide how best to proceed, so I'm going to do 2 ways of talking about 1619 Project and Christianity. So one will be very short, hopefully no more than 7-8 minutes, and then the other will be the longer discussion. That will be on what I describe as 1619 and the arrival of African Christianity in North America. So before we get to that, I'd like us to explore how the 1619 Project raises new questions for those of us who are exploring the history of Christianity in the United States. So one main point of the 1619 Project is to explore how slavery is central. And I assume in your first session and second session, briefly in this session and third session, that slavery was not something the United States got over in 1865 or the passing of the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, but slavery remains, the argument is, still a factor shaping American society even in the 21st century. So the question then is, how is slavery a founding and defining feature of U.S. Christianity? The second question could be related, is how were denominations funded on the profits of slavery and their institutions built with the labor of enslaved Africans? So for Presbyterians, for instance, Princeton Theological Seminary, I believe Columbia, Austin, have all gone through their records and looked at how some of their buildings were built by enslaved Africans currently on their campus today, and how some of their money came from the profits of enslaved Africans. One of the famous stories, I guess famous is not the best word to say, is Georgetown, that actually some of the funding was them selling enslaved Africans in order to fund some of the building of Georgetown University. So that's the question. And when you realize that you can actually go into a room or a building that was built by enslaved Africans in 2022, then you realize it is not over. Third question, how are denominations still shaped by the legacy and logic of slavery? One, the legacy is Again, as I described, the buildings that were built, funds that were raised. If you were in an endowed chair, or if you are a recipient of a scholarship, even a merit scholarship, it might have been funded by the profits from enslaved Africans. And realize, as you already know, I assume, it's not merely direct, but it could be the fact that a bank got its money from the sale of cotton that was raised on plantations of enslaved Africans. And so the predecessor of J.P. Morgan, which becomes Chase Bank, actually was built with some of those funds. And that could have been funding a scholarship or fellowship that you might have. The logic of slavery is, how do you pick up this notion that one group of people are superior and another group of people are inferior? And then lastly, on these questions, how does slavery shape explicitly and implicitly American theologies? There's debates, which I'll discuss briefly, is, does the baptism of a person enslaved require, because they're baptized, that they are to be set free, manumitted? So is there a connection between baptism and manumission? That was a theological question of the 17th century and of the 18th century in the United States. So how is slavery a founding and defining feature of U.S. Christianity? One is the fact that, unlike most other countries, we have denominations that are founded and run and populated by African Americans today. I think the last number I saw, that something like 70% of African American Christians belong to a black-led denomination. That's not true of Brazil, which has really has more people of African descent than we have, and that's not true of most other countries. Second, the splitting of Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians into northern and southern denominations prior to 1860 was, for the most part, over slavery. Those of you who are my age or a little older and you've been Presbyterian all your lives realize that there was a northern stream and a southern stream until you got to the 1980s. That was a legacy of slavery. So in the 1930s, the Methodists reunited, but one has to argue on what basis. And the basis that they reunited on was by segregating the African Americans who were part of the new United Methodist Church. Presbyterians reunited in the 1980s, and we have to ask the questions on what grounds was it reunited. And then, as you might know, the Baptists are still separated. There's still a denomination that emerges out of the pre-Civil War period called the Southern Baptist Church. And then the one that was separated in the north used to be called the Northern Baptist, which is now called American Baptist. And they are still shaped by the legacy of slavery. But in addition to these new questions about how slavery is a driver, the 1619 Project is also interested in how are Africans or African Americans central to the story of the United States. So I'd like to ask you a question, and I should tell you there's going to be a couple of places where I'd like you to raise your hand of what you think one of the options are. Those of you on Zoom can also do the same. So the question is, could African Christians and African Christianity shape the beginnings of Christianity in North America? If you have read an encyclopedia entry on North American Christianity or American Christianity, if you've read probably 99% of the books on history of Christianity, if you just read about the colonial period, my assumption is African Christianity and Africans are not present. It is as if Christianity in North America somehow leaped from Europe. The Anglicans from England, the Reformed from Scotland, the Catholics from France, that it leaped, and Lutherans from Germany, that they leaped to the United States and had no interaction with any other form of Christianity, such as African Christianity. So I'd like to talk a little bit about how would one develop a discussion of African Christianity being present and what might it have looked like in 1619. So it's entitled 1619 and the Arrival of African Christianity. So I assume you learned in social studies in 4th grade, 8th grade, or 12th grade. But if not, if you read the newspaper in any time during 2019, you'll realize that 20 to 30 enslaved Africans were brought to Jamestown or Virginia colony. So I'd like to ask you, what kind of society were these 20 to 30 Africans captured from? So if you could do me a show of hands, both online and in person here. How many of you think that these Africans came from hunter-gatherer societies? No one? How many of them think they came from the jungle? No one? How many of you think they came from villages? Looks like maybe 2/3. How many of you think they came from a kingdom? Nice number. How many of you think they actually came from an empire? Think there's no one? Well, it looks like they came from the kingdom of Ngongo. That's what historians have pinpointed, and that's within a modern day area where Congo and Angola are, sort of in that southwest quarter on the Atlantic coast of Africa. The kingdom of Ndongo is within the region of the Congolese Empire and other southwest central African kingdoms such as Ngoyo, Kakongo, and these kingdoms, to my surprise, I only learned this maybe 15 years ago, were actually urban cities with streets, chapels. The one in Congo had a cathedral, schools, and farming communities. Here's a picture of Mbanzo, Congo, which is the capital of the Congolese Empire. It's hard to see. I need to find a way of expanding, but you can see here, this is a multi-story building. Just think, how many rural towns in the United States have 4 or 5-story buildings? But they did in the early 1600s in the Congolese Empire. And you can see other buildings here that are probably 2-story. That's there. This is trying to get a little close up, but again, this is a 3 to 4-story building. These other 2-story buildings, all of that is part of the area, the larger area where these Congolese came from. Here's the palace. You can see there's a candelabra, and you might ask, why do you need a candelabra within Africa in the 15 or 1600s? Obviously, how do you read at night? The Congolese were very fascinated with books. And so among the many things they asked of the Portuguese, as the Portuguese are picking up items from them, in exchange, they wanted books. And so the candelabra helps you at nighttime be able to read. You can see this is sort of a silk kind of attire. You can see other items, but you can tell these are not hunters and gatherers as we know them. Here's the kingdom of Luango. And again, you can see these sort of boulevards, really sort of subdivisions almost, where people are living in the area. So could any of the Africans involuntarily transported from Ndongo be transported to the Virginia colony in 1619? Could any of them have been Christians? And there's scholars like John Thornton at Boston University, scholars who are lifting up the fact that they were, at least in their argument. And here's one of the pieces of evidences. So there's a letter that's written in 1619 by a local Roman Catholic bishop, Manuel Batista Soares, who expresses outrage that 4,000 plus African Christians, this is what he says in his letter, from Ndongo in southwest central Africa had been captured by slave traders. The letter shows them that a significant presence of African Christians in one of the regions where these Africans were captured by slave traders were Christian. So between 1619 and 1630, before the coming of British North Americans, where did other African Christians live? I'm not spending a lot of time, but there's the Dutch colony had African Christians in what becomes New York, New Amsterdam. If you ever know where Wall Street is, where the World Trade Center was, in that area, it's sometimes called Lower Manhattan, that's where the Africans were. And there was a congregation, a Reformed congregation, that had at least 40 Africans who were a member of its chapel by the 1630s and 1640s. But where else did they live? So between 1630, there were Africans who lived in England who were Christian. There were Africans who lived in Spain and Christians, and Africans who live in Portugal and Christians. I'm doing a presentation next month for a college in New York, and the beginning of it is called Black Europe and Christian Africa. Because if you took the same Western civilization course I took, Africans never showed up in the story of Western civilization. It was as if Africans somehow stayed in Africa and were not encountered by Europeans until Europeans came to Africa. Well, what I'm about to show, some of you might already know, but that there are at least 100,000 to 200,000 Africans who are in Europe during the 1500s. So prior to 1619, Europeans are already encountering Africans in Europe. There are also African communities that exist in England, Spain, Portugal, Italy. Matter of fact, a priest outside of Venice was an Ethiopian who was the pastor of that congregation, Roman Catholic congregation. There are African Christians in the Spanish American colonies, such as New Spain, which becomes Mexico, Peru, within the Portuguese colonies of Brazil, and then on the African coast, Angola. And then there are African empires of Ethiopia and of the Congo, as well as African kingdoms, as I mentioned, of Ndongo and Wari and Benin. By 1619 then, there were African Christians in Europe and in Africa and in the Americas. So when we then think of that and realize that some of the Africans that are coming over in 1619 and 1620 and 1625 and 1640 and 1660 might already be Christian, then it expands our notion of the founding of Christianity in this country. But the other thing it does is that if you were like me and took the same social studies class I took in Springfield, Massachusetts, in the books we saw, this is what Africans look like prior, at least, the 19th century. There's either the optic of the slave ship or the optic of the African in chains. However, this is a picture or a painting that was part of a book that was circulated within Europe of the emperor of Ethiopia who lives from 1496 to 1540, David II, or Dawid as they call him. And so this is the image that some Europeans had of African Christians in the 16th century. There's a painting, this would not have been circulated though, that within the northern part of South America, where Colombia is, there was a maroon community, a community where so-called runaway Africans, as they were called then, fugitives, renegades, they're sometimes called, created a kingdom there that they ran on their own, and it was called the Kingdom of Esmeralda. And this is a painting that was done in the 1590s of the way the elite in that kingdom dressed. So which optic does one carry in one's mind? What optic does one share in a classroom, with neighbors' children, public TV, Sunday school literature? Is it the one of the enslaved person, epitomizes what it looks like? Or is it these three leaders of the Kingdom of Esmeralda? So in 1619, what didn't happen? African Christians were not first introduced to Christianity on the slave plantations in colonial North America. We've already seen. There are already African Christians in Europe, in Africa, in the 1600s, and of course in Ethiopia going back to the 4th century. What did not happen? Only through slavery were Africans introduced to Jesus. No, they already knew Jesus, in Wari, Benin, Ndongo, Luango, Congo, Ethiopia, as well as those who were in Europe. African American Christianity, then, is not merely a slave religion, because Africans were Christians before the transatlantic slave trade. Africans and Christianity in Africa prior to 1526, some are part of the Ottoman Empire, who are in Egypt. Others are within the kingdoms that I mentioned. Others are part of empires. African Christianity in the Atlantic world between 1525 and 1516 are in these various places with various kinds of governments. So if you see on the African continent, this area here is where the Kingdom of Congo is, and Loango and Duango are. Here's where Wari and Benin, where modern Nigeria is. Cape Verde is off the coast here. Ethiopia is on this part of the continent. And there's even some African Christians in Mutapa, in the area where will become Mozambique and Zimbabwe. So if this was a classroom and we were opening up for discussion, I would want to get a test of the room, get the temperature of the room. Has our discussion so far confirmed what you already knew, challenged what you already knew, or changed what you knew about Christianity during 1619 and the decades following? So Ethiopia, as many of you know, was already an African kingdom a Christian kingdom by the 4th century, 300s. It's the time of Constantine, time when the Roman Empire becomes Christian. Ethiopia has also become Christian. Ethiopia is a Christian kingdom before England is, before France, and before Germany, not including, of course, Russia and Sweden and Norway. Ethiopia then, as Christianity, as I know, 500 years before it arrives in Russia, 600 years before Norway. This Christian empire of Ethiopia, according to David Levine, quote, have the prestige and renown of what they call Prester John, which is the emperor that was there, quote, who was then surpassed by no other Christian prince. One of the amazing things for Europeans was, as you know, Europe was never not occupied by Muslim governments until you get to the end of World War I. It's either Southwest Europe, Spain and Portugal. Then after they, quote, expel the Muslims then just go and occupy Southwest Europe, Bulgaria, Hungary, Romania, that region. And it's not until World War I that ends. But Ethiopia, though, on the other side of the Muslim divide, as they call it, was able to maintain its own when Christians in Europe could not. And so the prestige of Ethiopia as a Christian kingdom was very high in Europe in the 15th and 16th century. And not only was it high because of the fact that they were able to do what Europe could not do, but it was known as a land of gold and a land of a very pious monarch. And then prior to 1500, Ethiopians attend 2 ecumenical councils, one in Constance around 1414 and the other one in Florence around 1441. As well as Ethiopians had already had emissaries who go to the Vatican in 1402. Ethiopian Christians are in different parts of the Mediterranean world. They're in Jerusalem at least as early as the 13th century and remain there all the way throughout this period. There's others that are in Lebanon. There's others that are in Cyprus. Cyprus is a Venetian republic run by Venice at that time. By the late 15th century, the late 1400s, the Pope grants one of the chapels, which is right near St. Peter's Basilica, for the Ethiopians to celebrate their liturgy. and it's conducted in gays. And it's allowed to be a place for a hostel for Ethiopians to stay when they come to visit Europe. I mean, where are you going to stay if you're traveling to Europe? Except for an Ethiopian hostel, which makes sense. But they also will set up a college there, at least by the 1600s. Some of you might also already know, I've written a little bit about this, that in 1534, the German reformer Martin Luther is actually met by an Ethiopian cleric that, in the letter that Luther writes, he's called Michael the Deacon, or Abba Michael. And so there's a discussion that Luther, Melanchthon, another famous German reformer, and this Michael the Deacon have on theology. Michael the Deacon stays in Wittenberg, where they are, and they have these discussions on theology. And then Luther and Melanchthon write letters that they send out under their own name, recommending this Michael the Deacon because they said, we agree on the Trinity, we agree on the sacraments, and the areas that we don't agree on are not theologically significant. Martin Luther was interested in Michael the Deacon because he began to think on his own by reading about Christianity within Ethiopia. Yes, the Lutheran reformer, Martin Luther and Melanchthon, read about Ethiopian Christianity. And in their reading about Ethiopian Christianity, they saw that it looked like the Bible was in the vernacular, priests could marry, communion was bread and wine, and not one element only. They did not believe in purgatory, and they did not recognize the primacy of the Pope, yet they had been Christian for over 1,000 years. And Martin Luther thought that the church in Ethiopia goes back to Acts chapter 8. So he really thought they went back to the first century. And in his interview with Michael the Deacon, he finds out that all of that was true. So in the minds of some people, not many, Ethiopian church might have been a forerunner of the Reformation for someone like Luther. Showed you the Kingdom of Congo. Kingdom of Congo comes out of Portuguese evangelism. They create a very literate class because the Kingdom of Congo is not interested in being a mission state or a mission church of the Roman Catholic Church in Portugal, but they're interested in being just like a church in Europe. And if you're like a church in Europe at that time, that means you have priests, you have a bishop, you have schools, you have hymns, you have a choir, you have an organ, and they ask for all those things. So by 1500, there's already an organ that the Portuguese has shipped to the Congo. They already have priests that are being educated and then ordained. And then one of the sons of the emperor is consecrated a bishop by the Pope. So while there are Portuguese missionaries, there are Congolese catechists and teachers. And according to John Thornton, get this, by 1619, the King Afonso had funded and established a school system involving more than 1,000 students of noble families that created a literate class. Do you know that in many parts of North America during the colonial era, there was not a school that was a public school set up until the 19th century? Yet by 1516, the Christians in Congo had already done it. Do you know that in parts of Europe at this time, you either, as a woman, was educated privately, or you were educated part of a religious order? But in the Kingdom of Congo, they set up schools for boys and girls, and the teachers were men and women, all by 1516. By 1593, a college is opened up in Angola, which is a Portuguese-run colony, but it's there to train, again, the Congolese and others to be interpreters or catechists. So this Roman Catholic Church in the Congo opens up the school system with more than 1,000 students then, as early as 1520, or as I said, 1516. As one saw with the Russians becoming Christians and the Swedes becoming Christians, that a king gets converted, we see the same scenario within the Congo. So this isn't forced conversion. This isn't conversion with colonialism. This is an independent empire requesting Christianity. So by the mid-1500s, some scholars contend that there are over 200,000 Congolese Christians or Congolese citizens who've already been baptized, which they claim would be 50% of the population of the Kingdom of Congo. Province of Soyo also is a Christian province. It's there along the coast. And listen to this one traveler from Holland. He says, everyone goes the whole day with a book. Do you know that there are various parts of colonial America in the 1600s and 1700s that didn't have books? Books was a valued item. But he's claiming that this population does. There are various instruments, both percussive, string, and the horn. As I mentioned, the king, if you're a king, you wear a crown. I showed Loango. There's also African queens. So Africans then, before 1619, that are not only then in the place I mentioned before, but they're also in Rome, in Florence, in London, and in Amsterdam. The African Christians in Portugal, though, Portugal and Spain, they were able to achieve a level of mobility that one did not see in most other parts of Europe at that time, and would not be achieved within North America until the 19th century. So in addition to the 50 to 100,000 who are there, there's also the fact that the colleges in Spain and Portugal were open up to Africans as students. So by 1594, black African priests are already being trained in Lisbon. The cathedral school at Evora, St. John the Evangelist Seminary in Lisbon, the University of Portugal, all have Africans who are graduating during the 1500s. Do you know the first person of African descent to graduate from a school in the United States is like 1829? It's a debate between Williams College and Bowdoin College where I went. This is 200 years prior. During the 16th century, St. Aloy School was a multiracial educational institution. It had black Africans, it had South Asians, it had native Portuguese, all within the student body. And then by the 1600s, black Africans would study at St. Jerome College, St. Augustine College, the Jesuit College, and St. Anthony College. Do you know that in 1830, maybe Oberlin had African American students? Bowdoin and Williams had one or two every now and then. But yet, I haven't counted, but my suspicion is that there are more colleges and universities open to Africans to be educated and graduate from in Portugal in the 1500s than we will find in the United States till probably after the Civil War. So the first graduating classes then happens in the 1500s. Now, you're Presbyterian, you're part of the Protestant family. Everything I discussed so far was Orthodox or Catholic. So in the Protestant story, that there's at least 100 African Protestants, it looks like, by the 1590s in London. So 20 or more years prior to 1619. One is a woman by the name of Mary Phyllis. In 1611, another one is Dugere Jacques, who is the son of a prince in a part of Africa that's where modern Liberia is. His father sends him to London to be educated within the Christian faith and to be baptized in the Protestant church in 1610. Now, I'll be honest with you. When I first heard the story, I said, I know that young man is not going to make it back home. Somebody's going to capture him and send him to the Americas as a slave, an enslaved person. But the beauty is, some scholars have found that he does make it back. He returns, he runs into an occasional English traveler, and he interprets for them because he knows English. So the first Africans then that converted to Protestant were not in Virginia. They were in England during the 1590s. Any of you who are interested in Shakespeare? Shakespeare, the theaters in London then in Shakespeare era are similar to where they are now, which is in the West End of London. Some of these African Christians lived in the West End of London, and then some of them lived beyond the wall. So what that would mean is that when Shakespeare is writing about Othello, he's not writing about something that's a figment of his imagination, but he saw Africans in the West End of London as he's walking the streets. The Americas, there's African Roman Catholics in Mexico City, Lima, and Brazil. I already mentioned those who are part of the Kingdom of Esmeralda. There's even Congolese Christians who are emissaries, diplomats, we might call them today. They traveled to Brazil in the mid-1600s. Here's a picture of them, of two. Others go to Portugal, others go to Rome, others go to Amsterdam. Here's a Congolese nobleman visiting Brazil in the 1600s. So if you leave with any images, in addition to the one of the African who's enslaved with chains, I hope you also leave with the images of the three leaders of Esmeralda or of this nobleman. To say there's a variety of images that one has of African Christians. There's one African Christian called Juan Roque who lives between the late 1500s and 1623. He's the co-founder of a religious society, which are called confraternities. He's a philanthropist and he's also Roman Catholic. But what's shocked me is that prior to 1619, he's not only a husband and father who's legally married, but he's the owner of 3 houses in Mexico City. Quote, he stated, this is in his will, he stated that his deceased wife was a free black woman, and when bequeathing his profitable real estate in the neighborhood of San Hipólito, Juan Roque pointed to the status of his daughter, Ana Maria, as a legitimate daughter from his marriage, according to the Most Holy Church, to Isabel de Herrera, and therefore a free black woman. He ends up saying that he wants his 3 houses to go to his daughter, but if his daughter dies and has no children, then he wants them to go to the church. But in this case, the religious society that he and some other men had organized. So again, in addition to the African in the ships, which is real, in addition to the Africans in chain, which is real, in addition to the Africans that are pre-literate, who have not learned how to read and write, that's real. I want you to also have that in the formation of Christianity in North America, there are African Christians who are carrying a form of African Christianity that has produced people who are homeowners by 1620. And not just one home, but 3. And not just a homeowner, but one who actually has a will. And not only him, but the groups of college graduates, the groups of those who are priests, the one who's a bishop from the Congo, and there'll be 2 bishops who will be consecrated, priests who will be consecrated as bishops from Ethiopia, all prior to the 1600s. There's a scholar by the name of Ira Berlin who challenges us to rethink who the Africans are who come to North America in 1619. He calls them Atlantic Creole cultural brokers. First of all, what he means is that a number of them are literate, as we've also already discussed. Second is that they're multilingual. They know the Congolese language. They know a European language. Third, that they have lived in societies in which they're familiar with African cultures and practices, but they're also familiar with European cultures and practices because they've graduated from the schools, they've read the literature, they've encountered with different people. And so therefore they have a level of emotional and social intelligence that have them being smarter than the Europeans that they're encountering. How do we know that? That's how they're able to run away, create their own societies, and sustain them in some cases for 80 years as they do in Brazil. Parts of Jamaica, they do it all the way for over 200 years. So these Atlantic Creole cultural brokers then are the ones that we need to think of as the ones who are helping fashion Christianity in North America by bringing Congolese Christianity. These Congolese Christians then, as J. Loren Mayery says, will show up in Brazil, and Peru, and Venezuela, and St. Kitts, the Virgin Islands, Haiti, Cuba, Mexico, as well as colonial North America. And so therefore their presence is one that's throughout the Americas. They then create these intercontinental webs, as Ira Berlin says. And they create, as I said, these religious societies or confraternities or black religious brotherhoods. And this is not studied as much as it should be, but some of these confraternities connect Congo, Angola, Portugal, and Brazil. These are transatlantic institutions. There's the Brotherhood of the Lady of the Rosary, the Brotherhood of St. Ignatius, the Brotherhood of St. Francis, the Brotherhood of St. Bonaventure, Brotherhood of St. Benedict the Moor, or Benedict the African, and then the Brotherhood of Our Lady of the Rosary of the Blacks. So if the perspective of the presentation is correct, then what common assumptions about Christianity need to be challenged? And how do we need to rethink the story? How do we need then to rethink the story that Christianity in North America was not only introduced to the continent by French Catholics or British Anglicans or German Lutherans, but also by African Christians from the Congo, from Angola, from Cape Verde, from Spain, from Portugal, and from England. Let me stop. I'll be glad to entertain questions.
I don't have a question, but I do have a comment. I just wanted to thank you for bringing this education to us, because the trouble is, growing up here, and I'm originally from Europe, we have never been given this information. And this is basically new. And it's wonderful that you're giving it to us. Thank you.
So one of the participants here is born in Europe, and she said that her education in Europe, formal and informal, did not introduce her to the fact that there were Africans and African Christians in Europe in the 1500s and 1600s. Or that they interacted with people like Martin Luther and Melanchthon. So there is a small group of people, they call it I think it's the Black Europe Society or Black Europe Studies. And they've been, if I've tracked them well, about maybe 18 years have been exploring this. And there is some interest, but again, it's not the one where it's widespread. So I suspect students in schools are not taught it. I just had a friend that took a tour to Spain and Portugal. So I said, oh, by the way, this person was African American, and they were coming from a university on the East Coast, a major research university. I said, oh, by the way, are you visiting some of the sites where African Christians were in Spain and Portugal? And they said the tour guide didn't even know about it. So there's a whole multi-layer of elements that's there. And so again, going back to the optics that I had before, we have become so comfortable with the African in chains that we have no emotional space to explore and deal with African Christians who are contemporary with the others who are migrating to the United States or colonial North America in the 1600s. So thank you for your comment. Should we go to a Zoom question?
Question in the chat. And the question is, was the Congolese Empire aware of their people being taken? Were they complicit? Were they powerless to stop it?
Yes, so great question. So first of all, the answer is yes. There are letters from the King of Portugal throughout the 1500s writing to the King of Congo, writing to the King of Portugal, asking for them to stop having their people raided. Number two, slavery, as you know, occurred within Asia, Africa, and in Europe. As you might know, there's still slave markets in the 1500s in Venice, as well as Eastern Europe, as well as the Caucasus, Georgia, and other places, all in the 1500s. And so slavery is still everywhere. And the Congolese also practiced slavery, but they did not believe you could enslave a Christian, which is, of course, the same philosophy that some others had in different parts of the world. You could not enslave people of your own religion. So they were. It looks like, according to secular historians, that it is in the 1600s that the Portuguese intentionally undermined the Congolese society and that region by giving guns to the Congolese opponents, military opponents, in order to undermine their society, which then allowed for more people to be enslaved.
Another question in the chat is, how do Christian enslavers justify not freeing Christian slaves?
Great question again. So there's a slight possibility at the Synod of Dort, which is in 1618 in Holland. There are people there from different Protestant countries, including England. And it looks like they argue that you could not baptize. First of all, you could not take a person into slavery illegally, and then that you could not baptize that person unless you were going to manumit that person. It needs more discussion to see if that's final, that's there. I already mentioned the Congolese also believed you could not enslave a fellow Christian. So there's a whole debate in the 1600s, all the way up to the early 1700s, where there are Africans asking for their children to be baptized. And the assumption is that they were already baptized, either in Africa, or possibly if they came from the Caribbean, they were baptized within a colony in the Caribbean. And so they're asking for their children to be baptized. It is very clear by the literature that the Europeans had no interest in evangelizing Africans who were in North America. But the Africans wanted their children to be baptized. And so there's a letter statement that the Dutch write that says that these Africans want their children to be baptized, so we'll have to manumit them. So they deny all genuine spiritual reasons for baptism. And so with the pressure on the African side of African Christians wanting their children to be baptized, and again, they're Catholic or they're Reformed, which means you cannot baptize someone on your own. It has to be a priest or a minister. And so by 1660s, there's some pronouncements that come out and to say that baptism does not lead to manumission for those that are enslaved. And it says the reason why is because we must make a distinction between the soul, which will go to heaven, and the body, which is owned by the slaveholder. And then they looked at the Old Testament and saw the slavery was in the Old Testament, and then argued that this was justified. I'm not sure who's next.
I was wondering if you had opportunities to present this information to, say, Southern Baptists or others in those types of denominations, and what was their reaction?
Yeah, so I have not presented to Southern Baptists. I presented it in Europe and Germany. I presented it in Kenya, and then I presented it among some colleges in the United States, and then some African American congregations, and then some conferences, like student kind of conferences. So the question was, had I presented this presentation or something like it to groups like the Southern Baptists? And I was saying the answer is no. So the reaction has been a range. So there's some people who felt that this information was held from them, and that there was a conspiracy to have people think that all Africans were pre-literate, coming out of jungles, and had no sense of engaging the stereotype of what civilization is. So there was an element of anger on their part. There's another group of people who were surprised, but pleasantly surprised. And then there's another group of people who saw this as a critique of the notion, number one, that Christianity was a white man's religion that was used as a means to pacify and infantilize people of African descent. And by making them Christian, you make them passive. And so they were glad to hear that there's already exposure to Christianity, there's already discussion of Christianity, and there was already development before. At this point, I have had people ask me where I'm getting it from. So that's why I occasionally mention names so that people who might want to find out. Because there's some people I think, even though I have pictures, they think that I'm making it up. Because it can't be true. Otherwise, I would have known it already. Yeah. We'll go to Zoom. Any questions in the chat?
Yes. What happened to Congolese Christian society and institutions after Congo was made a colony?
Yeah, so very good question again. So first of all, Congo was not made a colony until 1880s. So we begin this discussion in the 1490s. So from 1490 to the 1880s, they're not a colony. Christianity remains vibrant in different parts of the Congo, even though the kingdom collapses by the 1700s. It looks like at least into 1790s. And maybe even there's some Congolese that are not organized within a church, but you have a cross, an understanding of baptism that takes us maybe up to the 1800s, and that's when there's the next round of missionaries who come, both Catholic and Protestant. So it's an unfortunate story that the Europeans undermined the society, sent guns and other weapons that created civil wars, and therefore the kingdom was basically collapsed, and the church collapses in the process. But before the church collapsed, they had even opened up a college in the Congo by the 1640s, and the president of the college was a person of Portuguese descent, person of Congolese descent, but I believe they were biracial, who had been educated, and some other people on the faculty. So they really were creating a society, and that's been after 1619, 1640. So there's this other trajectory of the narrative that's going. No one has asked this yet, but why were Africans able to graduate from colleges and universities, consecrated as priests, ordained as priests, some of them consecrated as bishops, some of them are famous, like Juan Latino, a famous poet during his time. Others are professors, not a lot of them, but a few of them are professors in the cathedrals, schools. Why was that able to happen prior to 1700? And we won't see anything like that until we get to the 20th century. My argument is that prior to 1700, modern racism did not exist. People were related to according to their religion. Are you Muslim? Are you Christian? Are you Jewish? Or are you a traditional religion? And those who were Christian were seen as being part then of the same family. And so the Portuguese created space for them to be able to do that. When modern racism comes, shaped by slavery, that cannot occur. Because some people are not educable. They don't have the cognitive ability for it. They don't have the spiritual capacity to be a priest or a pastor. And that then begins to shape, creating a society that you have white males who own property being at a certain level, and then everybody else being in different places on the pyramid.
Dr. Daniels, there is a question in the chat that is related to the comments you just made.
Okay.
True
Yes.
or not? Your lecture, which has been fascinating, doesn't change the takeaways from Nicole Hannah-Jones's 1619 project. Is that correct, true or false?
I'm sorry, say the question again.
Your lecture, which has been fascinating, doesn't change the takeaways from Nicole Hannah-Jones' 1619 project.
No, because again, I said there's two foci. One is slavery has a central role. That's where I open up with. That was one reason I did that. But the second, that Africans have a central role. And this argument here is that African Christians existed already part of institutions, organizations, level of education, and that they are a factor in what will become Christianity within North America. So the answer would be no. It's just that it doesn't start slavery. So where I do disagree is that what becomes African American begins in the Atlantic Ocean. There's a book called Born of the Water. I want to say no. It already starts on the African continent. It already starts within Europe. Yes, ma'am.
I took church history from you in 2006 and stuff, and when you taught modern church history, I remember learning about the Congo, but I don't remember this depth of knowledge. Can you talk about how the way that you taught, potential pastors who are going to preach on this kind of stuff, and transition from when I took church history until what you're sharing with people now?
Yeah, so I've been teaching church history since 1984, I believe it is. I was looking for how to widen the story. So I initially widened the story by talking about African Christians in Africa, Asian Christians in Asia, etc. But then, probably in the last 20 years, I began to realize that there are African Christians actually in Europe. And then it wasn't until the part on the Catholic side of Ethiopia impacting, I probably knew by 2000, and it wasn't until 2016 or so that I realized that that Ethiopians were intersecting with Lutheran Reformation or the Protestant Reformation in Germany. So it has to do with knowledge, discoveries, realizing, and this is discoveries of things that existed. So on Luther's letter existed, but it was only in Latin. And the translation of Luther's letters were not in English. The translation of letters that are in English did not include this letter. And so this letter I had to find in Latin, and then we had somebody translate it. Then I found another translation, and that then was able to tell the story. I'm sorry.
Could you share some information about the Black Madonna, like the one at Montserrat, just outside of Barcelona, Spain?
Yeah, so that's another interesting story. Again, sure, thank you again. Share about the Black Madonna. So there's an interesting, again, if I and a few others are right, that modern racism starts in 1700s, Europeans then are looking at people of darker skin as just being other Christians. So the Black Madonna is an example of that. Martin Luther, for instance, thought that 2 of the 3 wise men were probably of African descent. Saint Maurice, who was a famous warrior, was African until you get to around 1600, and then he starts being depicted as white. Same thing with the 3 so-called wise men, the 3 magi. Sometimes there's 2 or 3 are Africans, and then eventually maybe 1 of 3, and I think you've even seen some that are none. So all of that, my argument would be, is both leading up to modern racism, we change the optics that's there. Yeah. I think the last question from Zoom. Oh, I'm sorry, we're over.
Oh, there is one more question from the chat.
Yes.
Given the history that you've shared, in a nutshell, what gave Americans the idea that Africans could be captured and enslaved with impunity?
I'm sorry, can you say it again?
Yes. Given the information that you've shared, the historical perspective, What, in a nutshell, gave Americans the idea that Africans could be captured and enslaved with impunity?
So we must realize that in the 1500s, Africans were enslaved, people in the Americas were enslaved, people in South India were enslaved, people in part of what becomes Indonesia were enslaved. And then, as I mentioned, there's Europeans are enslaved by Muslims on the north coast of Africa, as well as some Europeans are enslaved within parts of Eastern Africa, part of Eastern Europe, and in the Ottoman Empire. So the first part is, I think they thought that slavery was something every society did. It's just that you enslave somebody else. But then, by the time you get to, say, 1700s, at least the way I see it, slavery is no longer one that includes the Asian Indians, even though it still exists there, include the so-called American Indian or First Peoples, even though it still existed here. But slavery then becomes exclusively identified with people of African descent. And then by 1700, people of African descent are seen as a people without civilization, without history, and are at the lower end of the educable abilities of people. The argument was that if you take those that lived in the jungle, they're living the closest to nature, and the closest to nature you are, the less advanced you are. And so therefore, some people saw this as these people were God ordained to be that way, the so-called curse of Ham. Others saw that this is a way to introduce them to, quote, civilization and Christianity. But again, as I tried to show, they already knew Christianity, and even civilization narrowly defined was already exhibited in parts of Africa at the time. Thank you so much.